I have a big collection of swords, as you might have guessed. Today I'm going to introduce you to 3 of my favourites and talk you through their pros and cons. Firstly, this sword. This is a gilded arming sword from the late 15th century, and it is super quick. This one is called a light in the darkness. You may have seen pictures of me wielding this. It is incredibly light and nimble in the hand. It doesn't weigh very much. When people have held it, they haven't believed how light it actually is. Beautifully made. You'll notice the blade is fairly strong triangular blade. There are wider blades than this in the medieval period, the late medieval period, but this one is a pretty good compromise. All the weight is up near the hilt. When you're wearing this sword, you hardly feel its weight at all. It's just slightly unnerving because you think you've dropped it, but in fact it's just there, especially if you've got armour on. You don't even notice you've got it on. I use it from horseback, and it is very, very good at hitting targets, but targets that are close to you. This kind of sword was a classic knightly blade, and it would have been carried and probably used more as a backup weapon, a little bit like a pistol might have been used in the Second World War by officers. You really don't want to be fighting with this, especially against an armoured opponent, if you can avoid it. But it is a symbol of your power, your knightly status, and actually against certain types of opponents and going for the gaps, it's actually very quick to use. Obviously one-handed. You could use it two-handed, but it's mostly one-handed. The next sword I'm going to talk about is bigger than this, but is deadly in a different way. This blade is fairly plain. It's a bit more workmanlike than the previous blade, but it is a superb bastard sword. That's the name. It's a hand-and-a-half sword, if you like. You may recognise this sword. This was the sword I used in the short Percival Arthurian legend short that we did using virtual production. So this sword has come on adventures with me many times. The blade is quite narrow all the way down its length, and it's still quite handy to use, but it does have more heft when you want to chop with it than the previous smaller one. So this is effectively a long sword. The names of swords depends who's talking about them and in what context, but this is significantly longer than the other sword, and really this is a one-handed if you have to, but more likely two-handed in general use type of blade. I do use it one-handed from horseback, and it's very good. It gives you a lot of reach, which is quite nice with a blade, and it cuts really well. It's a diamond section. You notice it doesn't have any fullers. It just has a diamond section, which makes it very stiff. So this is a sword really designed for taking on somebody with armour through mail, perhaps through the gaps. So you're not going to be able to stab through the actual plate. You might stab into it, but you're not going to do any damage to the person behind it, unless circumstances are extraordinary. Basically, you're going to try and stab this point into the gaps, through the eye slot, up through between the legs, into the armpits, in all those vulnerable parts of an armoured man that are not going to be covered by plate and possibly will be covered by mail, but not always. We have plenty of illustrations from the period of armoured knights fighting without gloves, believe it or not, and sometimes without any form of armour on their legs, which does sound a bit crazy, but I suppose people make choices based on what they think they're going to be doing and what kind of threats they're going to be undertaking. One of the fun things about using weapons and practicing with them is you do get familiar with them. They do become familiar objects and comforting objects in some ways, and I imagine that would have been exactly the same in the time period. Some people treat weapons as just tools to be disposed of. I also think some people come to appreciate the individual nature of these handmade objects, and whilst they're designed to kill, they're also designed to protect and guard other people. My first two swords are incredibly wearable. You can put them in a scabbard like this, hang them from a belt, and with a little bit of care you can just go about your everyday function, and the swords don't get in the way too much. They get in the way a little bit when you're sitting down. You have to be a bit careful, you have to be sword aware, but broadly speaking you can get on with doing things whilst carrying both of those two swords. My third sword, which is a new favourite of mine, is a monster and comes from the very end of the medieval period. Arguably it's not really a medieval blade actually, but I thought it was worth including because for some people swords are really long knives. This one is an awful lot more than a long knife. Let me go and show you. Now this is a big sword. This is what's known as a great sword. This comes in right at the very end of the medieval period and really isn't used very much, certainly not in England. It's used on the continent of Europe a bit more, and this form is a bit later. But you can see it is a monster. It's really an enormous sword, 6 foot long, and this one's sharp. And I don't really have the expertise to use this properly. There are fight books about how to use this. Most of the use of this type of blade, this great sword, are, as you can imagine, circular movements. There's so much momentum with this blade that you have to keep it going, and the handle is disproportionately long compared to the other swords. In fact, even the long sword, which is a two-handed sword, doesn't have this massive leverage. Because the blade is so heavy, it's still quite wieldy. You can still swap hands. You can hold here. This bit is sometimes covered in leather, but is protected by these extra side pieces. Now there's various debates about what they're used for, but you can use two hands very, very functionally. One hand would be extremely difficult. You could probably do it if you were very strong, but the hilt is so long that using it one-handed, the hilt actually gets in the way and will strike you. It is a bit more like handling a spear than a sword, and you could imagine the techniques being pretty much spear techniques. This sword is probably not very usable from horseback. It would be quite difficult to use it one-handed. You could potentially, here's an interesting idea, you could potentially use it as a short spear or lance. I've never seen anything like that, but you'd probably want a different, you're probably better off with a spear or lance, but you could quite easily. You could jam it under your arm and you could attack people that way. But riding one-handed with this, nah, you'd want a different sword. This one is just too much sword for use on horseback, but it is historically accurate and beautifully well made, thank you Joseph, and deadly in the right circumstances. This sword really is used in Germany and in the Italian city-states, and is often associated with mercenaries, with Landsknechts, Doppel soldiers, soldiers that are paid twice as much as everybody else, that attack pike formations. It's also associated with personal protection. You could hire a swordsman that knew how to use this blade, and a lot of the fight books are about protecting somebody who is on the ground in front of you from thugs in a street or on a bridge where you're crossing a canal. So this is quite a Venetian weapon as well, arguably, used in the urban environment, and really it's designed to keep people away. You sweep it around in wonderful sort of sweeping curves and movements. How effective it was in battle against somebody with armor or with a shield or even a shorter sword, I have a suspicion that if you had the confidence you can get inside this quite easily, but if you're unarmored this is going to do an awful lot of damage. And I am going to try using this and learn some of the techniques a little bit. We do have some really good fight books about it, and there are lots of movements, swinging around, And it's fascinating. It's quite a workout. It's quite heavy, but because of this leverage, you actually get a lot of movement at the far end of the blade. It's got a bit dirty as well, because one of the techniques in the fight book, you start with it like this, and you pose away on the Italian street, and then you kick it into its first position. They actually talk about doing that. I'm getting mud on the end of my sword, so I'm going to have to clean this. But it's fascinating that there's a lot of pretension and posing with a blade this long, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic. This is also associated with outrageous male fashion. Bright colours, tassels, huge hats, and it was a really violent, but really colourfully violent period in history after the medieval period. But a lot of people, like me, like to include this sort of, the heritage of the sword continues beyond the medieval period into the Renaissance.